Hello, how are you? This channel is about my 40 years in the music business. And over the course of the next few weeks, I hope to share some stories that you find interesting or amusing, thought-provoking even, who knows. My name's Paul, and this channel is Come As You Are. So do that. Go and get a coffee, settle down on the couch, put your feet up, take your shoes off, get into it. So let me just start as a bit of a recap from episodes that have gone before. And my first job was as a country salesman, going into deep regional areas of South Africa. And it was the very early 80s, so it was of course the peak of the apartheid era, where segregation was enforced on a very, very serious level, to the point where, as a white person, if I had a black friend and I wanted to visit him in, say, Soweto or Alexandra or one of the townships that surrounded Johannesburg, I would have to go to the police and get a permit, get permission to go. And if I didn't get it, I would get a call from the police or get arrested in the township, because of course there were no whites patrolling the townships in those days. And some of these townships were huge. Soweto was over 1 million people, officially. Unofficially, more like 3 million. Alexander was probably about 500,000 or 600,000. Further up the road, Tembisa, the same. And they were places where blacks lived and then caught trains into town to earn a pittance doing menial work in the cities. And then at the end of the day, they had to go home. They couldn't sleep in the city. So it was a hell of a society to live in. And the propaganda that we were subjected to started early, started at school. I remember being a kid of not even 10. And our principal gave us a lecture one day on the dangers of the black population that lived just down the road from us. And he warned us that we were going to have to learn to defend ourselves, because one day these people were going to drive you into the sea. That's what we grew up with. And the nationalist government were basically Nazi sympathizers. Half of the cabinet that ran the country at the time had spent the war years in jail because they wanted to fight on the side of the Nazis, not the English. Hated the English. With some justification, I might say. But that's a different story. To get back to mine, I set off with great expectation as a young salesman, with a new car, a list of hotels where I was going to sleep because I was out of town from Monday to Friday, and a list of customers with their addresses. But this, of course, was years and years and years before satellite navigation or mobile phones. So when I first set out, it took a long time to actually find these customers. But when I did, I found out that I had 2, at the most 3 customers in the city, in these regional cities, that sold white music. So I would do those 3 and set off to the next town, which would be, 100 odd kilometers down the road, and start again. And I'd been at it for a couple of months, and one day I saw a guy with a map open over the boot of his car, looking a little bit lost. And I sussed this was a sales rep just like me. So I walked over and asked him if he could help him. His name was Dave. He worked for opposition company, but within the same group of companies as mine. And he was trying to find customers. So I pointed out a few, and he was really grateful. It turned out we were living in the same hotel, and we organised to meet for a drink later on. And over the years, Dave and I became such good friends that many years later, he ended up being the best man at my wedding. Great guy. Still my best friend. Anyway, after chatting with Dave, I discovered that the orders that he was getting were sometimes 10 times the size I was getting. And he also had a far, far longer list of customers than mine. And it happened that it was a reason, the reason was that Gallo had a big black music catalogue. And by black music, I mean Zulu music, Shangaan, Sotho music, North Sotho. Because South Africa has 17 different tribes, each with their own language and each with their own music style. And because there were so many millions of more black people than white, there were a lot more traders for that music. So Dave let me on to a couple of those in the same towns that I was calling on. And they were in the main owned by Indian traders who opened up shop on the edges of taxi ranks or train stations where blacks would come into town to do their shopping or to work, and then would catch the trains or the taxis back out at the end of the day to go home because they weren't allowed to live in cities. So I learned where these places were, and I started going in, but I didn't have the catalogue to sell to these people because we had James Brown, Millie Jackson, Isaac Hayes, people like that. We had Verve Jazz catalogue, Pablo, great catalogue, but not for indigenous people. So I battled to pick up decent orders. And then one day Dave mentioned we were in a town called Welkom, and Welkom was on the edge of what was known as the Witwatersrand. And it was a ridge that ran from one end to the other, probably 400 or 500 kilometers. And it was basically solid gold underground. The richest mines in Africa, in the history of the world, really. But in this town called Welkom, there was 63 mine shafts. Now, let me explain. The mine shaft were these huge constructions that were like giant lifts that used to drop down into the bowels of the earth, sometimes 300 meters or more. And in the lift, which was like a giant cage, they had hundreds of workers at a time. They would plunge down, disgorge them into the bowels of the earth, go back up, pick up the next load and go down. And all of these mine shafts were inhabited by countries that were on the borders of South Africa. And these workers were given a one-year contract. They were termed migrant workers. They were given a one-year contract. And on some of these shafts or compounds, there were 25,000 people. So it worked. 12,000 of them would be underground and 12,000 would be above ground. And 12 hours later, they would come up, but the other lot would go down, and so on. It went on 24 hours a day. There was no stop. And they worked like that for a year. And at the end of a year, they were paid their money and they went home. So Dave told me about these calls, concession stores, they were known. And I clearly remember the first day I turned up at a concession store because these things were huge. They looked like a small gated community. And milling around outside these stores was anything up to 10,000 black workers because they weren't allowed to go into the town. They had to stay on the compound. They were housed in single quarters on the premises. And the first thing I realized when I pulled up was that this is what Africa looked like. This was like something I had never seen. There wasn't a white face to be seen anywhere, except inside the concession store, where mainly Greek traders ran a joint with black staff. These places were huge. But I can recall the first day I got out of my car. The first person that came to mind was my principal in Standard 3, who warned me that these were the people who were about to drive me into the sea. And I wondered for a minute whether this was going to be my last day on earth. But it wasn't. And I remember walking back to my car after getting my order and looking at these guys around me who were all friendly and who were all decent folk. Waved and couldn't speak a word of English, laughed, helped me to my car. And it was the first day of my life as I drove away from there that I realized that what we had been told about blacks during the apartheid era was a lie. And I felt embarrassed. And I wanted to learn more about that society because it really appealed to me. And it was the beginning of an incredible career. And I, to this day, rate it as some of the best time of my life. I'm going to leave it there for now. Tune in next week and we'll continue the adventure together. See ya.